Our final speaker for today is best-selling novelist and poet Chris Abani. Born in Nigeria, he's Board of Trustees Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Northwestern University in Chicago. Chris has penned 7 poetry collections and 6 novels, among which is Graceland, which won the PEN/Hemingway Book Prize and the Hurst and Wright Legacy Award. Another novel, Song for Night, was distinguished with a PEN Beyond the Margins Award. Among his other honors are a PEN Freedom to Write Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Lenon Literary Fellowship. Chris is going to be talking to us tonight about how stories make lived experience real, what in stories enable that sense of reality, and also how stories can enable us to interrogate the concept or the term immigrant, migrant, and the concept of identity that would be associated with the concept of immigration and that term migrant. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Chris Abani.
Here we go. I just want to say thank you to Byron, the Kansas Center for African Studies, Elizabeth McKenzie, Peter, the NEH, my fellow panelists, Marta and Garth, but most of all, you. Thank you for coming. So, yeah, give yourself a round of applause. So here's the thing is, if you've been listening, there's a lot of reference to Nigerians up there, and I'm Nigerian, so I thought I'd start with a small joke that gives you an insight into how irreverent and strange Nigerians are. So, and it's also about migration. So this Nigerian, his name is John. So John walks into a bar and orders 3 glasses of beer and then sits in the back end of the room drinking a sip out of each one in turn. And when he finishes, he comes back to the bar, orders 3 more. And then the bartender says to him, you know, beer goes flat after it's in the glass for a while. It would taste better if you came for one at a time. John replies, well, you see, I have 2 brothers. One is in Dubai, the other is in Canada, and I'm here in Nigeria. So when they left home, we promised that we'll drink this way to remember the days we drank together. And the bartender liked it and thought this was a great custom. And so John becomes a regular and does this all the time. One day, John comes in and orders only 2 beers. And all the other regulars notice and they fall silent. And when he comes back to the bar for the second round, the bartender says, I don't want to intrude on your grief, but I wanted to offer my sincere condolences on your great loss. John looked confused for a moment, then said, oh, no, my brother's not dead, everything's fine. But the thing is, I just quit drinking, so... So I want you to approach everything I tell you with the same idea of irreverence. I should also point out that there's a term in the title that's nativist. Nativist here doesn't refer to the original owners of the land we are standing in, Native Americans, but to the idea that as Americans we're struggling for a kind of nativist fixed identity, which is at the core of all our fear of immigration. Epigraph. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Dylan Thomas. I was born in December 1966 in a small Igbo town in southeastern Nigeria called Afikpo. And my father will claim later that my mother's protracted labor was a catalyst for the Nigerian Biafran Civil War that began that month, that year. A small, rather obscure fishing town at the end of a dusty road going nowhere, Afikpo became important in that war because that dusty road ended in the 3rd largest river in the country and offered perfect secondary access points to the Igbo homelands, allowing Nigerian troops to pincer them between the hills of Nsukka in the north and that river, the Cross River, in the south. My English mother was making lunch when my uncle came running to the house. He breathlessly told her that the Nigerian army had landed at Ndibe Beach 3 miles from our home and were marching into town. He didn't think it would be a good idea if she were around when they arrived. My father was out, and so my mother gathered my 3 brothers, Mark, Charles, and Greg, and me, barely 2 weeks old, and as much stuff as she could carry or make the boys carry. Important documents, passports, water, some crackers, a lantern, me, and an umbrella. I almost got left behind for the umbrella, but that's another story. And as As we made our way through the long lines of refugees fleeing our town, we were to see many umbrellas, as though everyone had grabbed one to protect himself or herself from the rain of sorrow. My father found us on the road leading to the neighboring town of Eda and the Catholic mission there. And as we drove the rest of the way, our car threading the needle of road packed with refugees, that car marked a short-lived privilege. War levels the playing field, and just like that, you wake up one day and you lose everything by lunchtime. We parted ways with my father that December in 1966 at that Catholic mission compound. My father joined the newly minted Biafran army and stayed to fight, while we left with a ragtag party of refugees that included some missionaries. Our destination was the small western Igbo town of Uli, where the Biafran army had turned a highway into a landing strip for the Biafran forces, and the planes flying in with relief and aid from the Red Cross and Caritas, the Catholic Aid Company. We would meet up with my father once more in 1967 when he found us at a refugee camp in Mbise. He returned to the war a week later, leaving my mother pregnant with my sister Stella. The journey from Eda in 66 to Uli airstrip in 68, where we boarded a plane first for the island of Sao Tome, then on to Lisbon, and then on to London, a short distance of only 200 miles, took 2 years instead of 4 hours. The dangerous trip was made so because my mother, with 4 young children and one on the way, was a white Englishwoman. 2 months before we got on that plane out of the country, my mother gave birth to my sister in a hospital that was being evacuated during a bomb raid. While the rest of the patients were moved to a safer location in a primary school a couple of miles away, my mother had to stay behind in the hospital, locked in labor, as the bombs rained down from Nigerian Air Force planes, attended only by the Irish nun, who was also the midwife, Sister Tumi, and a terrified 18-year-old nurse who my mother remembers as Angela. Sister Tumi sat with my mother, drinking Earl Grey tea and eating cookies, getting up to wheel my mother's bed from ward to ward ahead of the bombs, a bizarre game of musical beds. My sister screamed into the world 30 minutes before the hospital was completely destroyed, and so even in moments of death, we are blessed with life and the gifts of hot tea and cookies. Epigraph. Culture of the mind must be subservient to the heart. Mahatma Gandhi. I have always believed in the power of stories. They shape the world, they shape things, bring presence into focus, give it form, give us a way to negotiate the space between our body and the world. They also give us a way to connect to each other, to build a common shared imagination. The myth of modern America is such a story. It is a myth of opportunity and also of choice. An immigrant, the idea of immigration, that America is a nation only of immigrants. An immigrant is a person who leaves their home to settle in a new one, to be close to family, or to increase their opportunities to be greater, even when they have good opportunities at home. This is really the UN's definition of an immigrant. It implies choice, it implies freedom and ease of movement, it implies fluid and flexible borders, equal treatment of all migrants, and a welcoming host nation, and a real leaning into diversity as a source of greatness. The myth is that from the Puritans, who were actually fleeing repression in Europe and were therefore refugees, not immigrants, to all successive waves of migration to years, it has been an easy road for all to greatness in this wonderful utopia. This land of equal opportunity is the myth that shapes our shared imagination. It is the story that we are choosing to subscribe to. But it's not entirely untrue, but it is more than a little shaded with rose-tinted glasses. A shared imagination is the surest way to flex the muscle of empathy, but in this case, only for those who can share that story. And what it also does is it convinces us we are right. It creates a moral order for what can often be cognitive dissonance. So what is the difference between an immigrant and a refugee? A refugee is defined as a person who moves from their home to another due to severe economic restrictions or danger to their lives and property. The mid-1800s in Europe were a period of upheaval. To name just a few things, we had nationalist uprisings and rebellions against despotic monarchies which swept through much of the landmass and displaced a great many of the working class. There was the Great Potato Blight of Ireland that led to mass starvings. These, of course, led to massive waves of migrations to the U.S. It is tempting to call these movements immigration, but they are not. They are at best forced migrations, but they are really, if we are honest, refugee crises. There is also the forced relocations of Africans into slavery to be contended with, plus the internal refugee movements. First, the great migration of freed African Americans from post-Civil War South, segregationist South, and the refugee crisis and migrations caused by the Great Depression, and we cannot forget the arrival of the Chinese workers in the 1900s as indentured labor for the railroads. There are many, many more instances. As you can see, these terms apply across the board to different Americans, from the earliest European settlers to the present day. We even have overlapping movements of immigrants and refugees in the same period. The United States is a nation that fears immigrants and refugees as much as we are a nation of both of these people. America has met each successive wave of arrivants with difficulty, with some violence, and also with compassion, don't get me wrong. America prides itself on a kind of Christian universalism and democratic equality, yet each new arrival creates expansions and ripples in the definition of the American self that appears to negate what historian John Hyman asserts, that this new land will bring unity inevitably out of diversity, in fact, as a matter of course. The real fear, I think, for us Americans is the fluidity and constant renegotiation of identity that new arrivals generate. We can never, it seems, settle into a clear nativist identity because we generate, and partly because our identity, an attempt to create a nativist identity, always generates back for us the specter of the genocide against Native Americans. The difficulty is every new group brings new religions, new ethnic dimensions, new challenges to centers of power and privilege, new political identities. We can see this reflected now as Trump continues to rant on about all the impossible things he intends to do. In a way, though, it's nice because we know that at least he doesn't have a plan for anything, unlike Rubio, who had very clear plans. This is the true cost of democracy, though, that we will always be in flux as regards power and identity, that we will never have a very clear universal American identity, that our identity will always continue to change, it will always continue to have to evolve as a nation, as uncomfortable as that makes us. And for this, we need the myth of origin to allow for the immersion of ourselves in a fragile and vulnerable humanity, an immersion that develops compassion for self and others. I've been cutting a lot for purpose of time, so you can ask me more with questions. Epigraph. Perhaps home is not a place, but simply an irrevocable condition. James Baldwin. Perhaps no other body causes as much anxiety as the body of the refugee. Refugees generate complex anxieties wherever in the world they go, wherever they try to resettle. The difficulty with refugees is the real concern about where they fit into the host culture and the real economic cost of helping the displaced when it seems that there are so many Americans who are going through a very difficult time themselves. We stretch towards compassion fatigue. These are perfectly natural responses, but these responses are unfairly displaced onto the refugees rather than our own ineffective governments. It is doubtful that American poverty is caused by the influx of immigrants and the dispossessed, but they present a compelling and easy target. These anxieties and their true costs continue to remain a complex negotiation. The refugee is also challenging, is both a challenging and a romantic body to the modern sensibility because it carries all the marks of the shadow that we have buried or at least blunted, and simultaneously all the possibilities of our current status. We realize when we confront the refugee that we're staring into the mirror of our own memories of displacement, however slight or small we may feel those displacements to be. We remember the loss that still resides deep within us, and it calls to our own suffering, and then we are caught in a web of extreme difficulty. How to balance our compassion with the need to define the limits of hospitality, both of which are needed if we are to help our displaced friends find their dignity again. This is something that James Baldwin has addressed, but also, if you remember that wonderful speech by Barack Obama after the moment in which he is accused of being a terrorist with Reverend Wright, where he talks about the complex negotiations of white Americans, what we give up in order to gain whiteness. We're no longer French Americans, we're white. And this complex negotiation, where we have to give up so much in order to fit in, creates an equal psychic pain that often goes unaddressed within the complex narrative that has become in America. There can be much anger, much confusion, and irrational fear associated with the integration of refugees, and this is part of the struggle. These anxieties are not new, nor are they uniquely American. What is uniquely American is the shame and silence around these feelings. If we are to make any progress in this area, we must learn to talk, and to talk outside the matrix of right and wrong, outside the matrix of demagoguery, outside of the Trumpisms and the Bushisms, but rather learn to negotiate our own fears and insecurities and accept the fact that even though we may seem to have material wealth, we do have a psychic pain that can never be addressed. We should speak to each other, but temper our words with fairness, with a true attempt at understanding. We should temper them with compassion. The ethical question that this matter poses for us is, are we going to give in to our fear and reject the influx of new peoples and the fluidity it demands of us, or are we going to uphold the values that we claim in our myth of origin, words emblazoned on the Statue of Liberty, words we have built into the Constitution, a myth that makes us great? I believe we will choose wisely. That is a story I choose to believe. Epigraph. Everyone forgets that Icarus also flew. Jack Gilbert. We had been traveling for days, it seemed, but perhaps no longer than 2 when that little plane touched down in Lisbon with only 2 of its 3 wheels working. We were only supposed to be in Lisbon for a couple of hours while we transferred to a flight to London. It would take 3 days before seats on that flight would become available. Luckily, we stayed in a convent, but returned at the crack of dawn every day to haunt that airport until the last flight left. I wonder now what people thought of that crazy white-haired, bedraggled Englishwoman and her brood of black children. On our second day of waiting in the airport, when an Englishwoman leaving Lisbon for London after her holiday in the Algarve, her family clutched close, came up to my mother and asked, "You're right, love. I mean, why are you so bedraggled?" And my mother telling her of the war in Biafra, and that we were waiting for the Red Cross to find us a flight to England, and that it hadn't been too bad because even though it had been 3 days, there were at least no bombs, and that we were refugees, her mouth struggling with the shame of that word, her eyes proud even in her condition. And this woman emptying her suitcase, plying a new dress on my mother, and her children's clothes and toys unto us, and my mother crying, tears falling for the first time in 2 years, and she would later tell me that we can harden our hearts to the greatest pain, but that the kindness of strangers will unstitch us. And to this day, I ply strangers with food and gifts in airports, trying to make up for that woman's kindness, chasing startled Midwestern women around saying, "Would you like a cup of coffee?" And when we finally arrived back in England at Heathrow Airport in London, my mother's heart was broken again by the immigration officer who wouldn't let us in because she had lost her passport, and no, they didn't recognize the Red Cross travel document issued by those Portuguese, and that was fine. Even if she was English, and she certainly looked and sounded the part, even if she did smell a bit, there was no way he was allowing those nigger babies into the home country. And back and forth until an older official, saddened by the treatment meted out to her, allowed my mother through. And my mother silent through the car ride to the home of her birth, where my uncle, who kept saying over and over again, "Well, really, I mean, look at you." And that's what happens when you go to live like one of them in the jungle. And my mother's tears again, my mother's tears dry again, like her milkless breasts and her heart closing to it, and my grandmother fussing with us in the back seat. And back to that small English town of Burnham, where the local paper already had a headline announcing Daphne's triumphant return with her children, and the neighbors pouring in, the men with strange looks and curious glances at the little monkeys running around, while the women handed over packets of food and clothes and medicine and books and toys, and picked up and plied us with hugs and kisses, trying to make up for what they thought we had lost. All of them were in that embarrassed look of the English when caught in a moment of unexpected kindness. Before she died 8 years ago, my mother told me the thing about difficult times, about loss, is that we forget the joys too. We forget that even in the falling, we are also flying. Thank you.